a spirit of reconciliation, Law Squared acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respect to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today.
Well, hello and welcome to this webcast, the How to Design a Safe Workplace in 2025, Respect at Work and more. I'm your host, Cassandra Hatton, the Chief People Officer here at Law Squared. As we reach the midpoint of 2025, it's more important than ever that we understand the Respect at Work principles and how they're shaping modern workplaces. Respect at Work, of course, refers to a set of legal principles designed to prevent sexual harassment, discrimination, and other harmful workplace behaviours. These principles require employees to take proactive steps to create a safe and respectful environment for all employees. But creating a safe workplace goes beyond just simply meeting these legal requirements. It's about designing spaces, both physical and virtual, that support well-being, inclusivity, and mental health. So today, we'll explore how workplace design plays a crucial role in fostering psychosocial safety, addressing the root causes of workplace harm, and ensuring that respect is embedded in both culture and environment. And to help us do that today, I am joined by two very experienced guests. So please help me welcome, firstly, Dr. Laura Kirby, Executive Director and Chief Psychologist, Australian Psychological Services. Dr. Laura Kirby is a registered and endorsed organisational psychologist with more than 15 years' experience working with organisations across Australia and the globe. Specialising in workplace psychological health and safety, Laura has designed, implemented and evaluated strategic workplace services to enhance the mental health and associated systems within organisations. Laura has held several senior and executive positions in corporate settings focused on enhancing the strategic approach to workplace psychological health and safety, including as the inaugural Chief Mental Health Officer at the Commonwealth Bank of Australia. Laura is an Executive Director of Australian Psychological Services and the Chief Psychologist. So welcome, Laura.
Thank you so much for having me, Cass. Great to be here.
Wonderful to have you. And please also make welcome Andrew Brooks, who will be well known to many viewers today, having worked extensively as an employment law advisor to many of Law Squared's clients across both the for-profit and not-for-profit sectors. Andrew and his team help employers and their management team deal with daily staff issues and complex legal problems as they arise during the employment life cycle, of course, through the cycle hiring, managing and firing. This is either by an ongoing retainer or Law Squared as a service, LSAS, as some of you may know, where Andrew practically becomes the employment law extension of your business or through ad hoc engagements as well. Andrew is also the driving force behind a library of free legal resources aimed at helping organisations comply with employment legislation and emerging trends in the workplace, including the free sample sexual harassment policy and prevention plan and the psychosocial hazards need to know guide. So if you haven't got your hands on those things yet, you should absolutely do that. So great to have you, Andy.
Thanks, Cass. Thanks for having me.
Wonderful to have you both. It's going to be a great conversation full of wisdom, no doubt, for all of our listeners. So listeners, hopefully you know the drill by now. We've just got 1 hour together, so we're going to manage the time together. So to help us manage time, please drop your comments and questions to our chat moderator, Alicia, in the sidebar to the right, and we will respond with an FAQs and some resources after the webcast. So let's get started. Perhaps we can start with the basics. Andy, maybe you could talk us through, give us a quick refresh on what is required under the Respect at Work legislation and what are the penalties for organisations of failing to do so. Take us through it.
Perfect. So what a small question to start with. So maybe if you'll let me, I'll go through a little bit of a brief history just because I think it adds kind of context for where we kind of got to. And I always like to think of Australia as kind of one of the most progressive countries in the world in terms of employment law and also safety in the workplace. But it's quite actually a shameful past in Australia. The stats don't support that in terms of sexual harassment. So the latest Australian Human Rights Commission report that I've seen was a pretty damning statistics in terms of who actually has experienced sexual harassment in the workplace. So if I read them through really quickly, more than 40% of women and 26% of men have experienced workplace sexual harassment in the past 5 years. And what's even more shameful is that those numbers jump up if you're part of a marginalised group. So if you identify as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander, that number jumps up to 56%. in the past 5 years, which actually means it's more likely than not that you've experienced it. The LGBTIQA plus community, that also jumps up to 46%. And then also younger workers, so between the ages of 15, 29. So the people that we're arguably should be looking after the most, that number jumps up to 46% as well. So we've kind of got these really damning stats that kind of push against this idea that we're always a really good operator, I guess, as employers. We're also really seeing mental health injury claims skyrocket over the past 10 years from a workers' compensation perspective, which only further kind of adds weight to this argument that we're not as good as we should be. So very briefly, about 10 years ago, only about 3 to 4% of all workers' compensation claims were mental health injury related. Most of them were physical injuries, and it kind of made sense. You've had construction companies on sites being broken arm. That would be most of the physical injuries that would come through. We're now sitting more close to that 12% of all claims. And also in Victoria, they predicted they'll go up to 30% by 2030. So we're kind of saying this context is going to come in that keeps supporting the idea that we're actually very bad at providing a safe workplace in terms of sexual harassment. So the Australian Human Rights Commission back in 2021 released this giant report with a huge amount of recommendations to try to effectively say, well, this sucks, we need to be way better. And one of those recommendations was to provide or to mandate that employers have this positive duty to prevent sexual harassment in the workplace. So it just was fortunate timing in some ways. 2022 came along, the Labor government came into power, and they kind of used that as a bit of a mandate to introduce some changes in this space. And one of those changes was bringing in this positive duty now to eliminate, as far as reasonably practical, because lawyers always have that little condition, sexual harassment in the workplace. So now instead of it just being a little bit less clear, it's now this really clear kind of mandate that employers have to actually take proactive steps rather than in the past when we're a little bit more responsive. So something would happen, we'd take steps in response to that. But this is really trying to make it so we're trying to prevent things from even occurring in the first place. Now, I know lawyers always love to talk about penalties because it kind of makes people want to go to lawyers more. But there are some significant consequences in this space now if employers and businesses and also senior leaders kind of do this really badly. So effectively now, and it does change slightly state to state, but if we just take Victoria as an example, if you have inappropriate behaviour such as sexual harassment in the workforce, you can see general protections claims come through, stop sexual harassment claims at the moment, and negligence claims are coming through. We're seeing state regulators come on site now specifically to investigate sexual harassment complaints and concerns. And then the big nasty numbers, individuals within Victoria, for example, if I try to get the particular numbers up, it can get up to $332,000 in penalties for an individual senior leader, but then also staggeringly up to 25 years imprisonment. Now, I know these are maximums, so again, we love to talk about maximums because they sound scary, but and there are a lot of things that would need to go terribly wrong for these numbers to get anywhere close to being relevant. So, for example, someone would very tragically need to lose their life due to the negligence of a senior leader. But if my job is to just set out kind of what the potential penalties are in this space, we are now looking at imprisonment and financial penalties. So, which I think is a great thing from a society perspective. You know, we should be really trying to deter bad actors in this space. And more so for me, it's a really useful tool to try to persuade senior leaders and managers at lower levels to take this really seriously. Because if they're not persuaded by a moral, ethical kind of standpoint, which I think arguably we should all be, they may be more likely to be persuaded by the fact they could end up in jail. So yeah, that's my little 5-minute TED talk, I guess, on kind of how we got there and what the law is and kind of the consequences. But I'm really keen to kind of hear a lawyer's standpoint as well. I'm sure you've got a lot of other questions to go through, Cass, from a people and culture perspective, but that's the legal 101, I guess.
Yeah, what a helpful overview. And I think most people, as you say, we hope or would agree that this is such an important topic for organizations and employees to take seriously. But when you share the statistics like that, it really does make a compelling case, a very sobering statistics indeed. I've been working across Australia and the UK for the last few years and agree Australia has always seemed, even more so become evident that Australia is quite progressive in the employment law landscape. But again, when you hear these statistics, there's still more to be done and employers really should be taking this work seriously. So thank you for that overview. So Laura, what's your take on respect at work and what it means in the context of the modern workplace?
Yeah, look, echoing probably many of Andy's sentiments here, we've seen obviously the changes in the health and safety legislation space certainly start to acknowledge harmful workplace behaviours, including sexual harassment, much more explicitly than it has in the past. And this is something that sometimes employers that we interact with aren't necessarily aware that that obligations exist under health and safety laws as well as those positive duty laws. We have concurrent, thankfully quite unified approaches under the two in terms of focusing on that prevention as well as response angle when it comes to our workplace sexual harassment and other forms of harmful behaviours. So certainly the space that I tend to operate is in all things psychosocial hazards, and harmful workplace behaviours is an example of a psychosocial hazard the workplaces are obligated to take steps to eliminate, where, again, I'll use the language, reasonably practicable, and where it can't be eliminated, taking steps to minimise impact and harm of those potential hazards. So I think I certainly see in the harmful workplace behaviour space much greater steps being taken, thankfully, I think, in terms of what does good look like from a prevention point of view. I think we've had a longer history of being mindful of how we respond to these incidents, but what does good prevention look like, and what are the steps that we're taking to address the workplace factors or driving causes that create enhanced risk of people experiencing harmful behaviours in their workplace setting. So yeah, I think I'm sure we'll get into all of those factors in terms of driving factors, but it's certainly acknowledging that it is a hazard we're obligated to address.
Absolutely. And it's such an important maturing of the landscape, isn't it, to shift from that responding to preventing. So I'm really looking forward to hearing a little bit more about how our viewers can do that. One thing that does create confusion is the distinction between psychosocial safety versus psychological safety. So I'm wondering, Laura, if you could take us through that.
Absolutely. It's one of my bugbears. I'm happy to get this straight. And Andy, please jump in to help clarify as well. Certainly when we're talking about psychosocial risk or safety, we're essentially talking about steps that we're taking to manage hazards within the workplace that aim to prevent psychological and physical harm occurring to employees, as well as promoting positive elements of work. So under that umbrella, we're taking steps to manage psychosocial hazards, which are those workplace factors that are likely to cause physical and or psychological harm. Psychological safety, on the other hand, is more of a cultural phenomenon that was first introduced publicly or largely recognised under Amy Edmondson, which speaks to the belief that people feel comfortable to raise concerns, suggest ideas, take reasonable risks within the context of their work without fear of retribution. And to maybe make it slightly complicated, what I would say is psychological safety is a really important tool for how we take steps to control and manage potential psychosocial hazards. But when we speak to employer obligations, we're really talking about those holistic steps that they're taking to prevent harm occurring to people with mental health or psychological health and safety, as well as their physical health and safety, as well as enhancing those protective and positive elements of work. Andy, would you add anything in there?
Much more articulate than I would have fumbled through, so that actually sounds, but I might steal that when I talk to clients.
By all means.
Excellent. So maybe let's go in a step even further, Laura. How do you see psychosocial hazards, now that we understand that distinction a little bit more? How do you see psychosocial hazards like bullying, harassment, discrimination impact employees' mental health and overall well-being in the workplace? And secondly, what are the broader benefits that organizations see when they create these psychologically safe environments?
So I think the first part is probably somewhat obvious, in that we know that when people are exposed to harmful workplace behaviours, which include things like bullying, harassment, sexual harassment, gender-based discrimination, that they are at greater risk of experiencing poor mental health or mental illness. And we've seen that, again, echoing Andy's sentiments around the statistics, we've seen that one of the top two leading causes of workers' compensation claims from a psychological perspective has consistently been exposure to bullying and harassment. And we're seeing that trend continue to rise. So there's certainly the cost implications of not addressing these harmful behaviours and, generally speaking, reducing the mental health of our workforce when we rely quite heavily on them being high-performing, high-productive individuals, which, for my view, is the flip side of this, is that when we focus on the benefits that we receive by investing in the mental health of our workforce and emphasising those protective elements of work, preventing harm to our people and driving equitable, diverse and inclusive cultures, then I think the often less talked about benefit here is thinking about that in business terms. That's a really important strategic human capital investment that drives high productivity, high performance cultures, enables creativity and innovation. We're much more likely to have people perform with discretionary effort. And anyone in HR will know if we rely very heavily on people performing under discretionary effort without necessarily descriptive PDs that explain what they do. And so I think there's an opportunity to speak a little bit more in terms of, that focus on the opportunities and the investment that we receive as a result of taking steps to ensure that we're working in a psychosocially safe environment for our people.
Yeah, amazing. I think this topic is talked about more openly generally, isn't it, across community, employment landscape, organizations. It also is becoming a value proposition. Unfortunately, it shouldn't need to be one, but employees and candidates seeking, where is their next opportunity are interested in how organizations manage this and how across this they are, what proactive steps they're taking. So let's talk a little bit about that. And in fact, before we talk about how organizations might step in and make plans to do this, who's responsible? Who in organizations should be thinking about this? Does it lie with people and culture? Where would organizations or should organizations get legal support? Andy, what are your thoughts about who should be kind of driving this forward?
Well, I guess the technical legal answer is that everyone owes a duty of care to everyone else. So it's actually not one in which you can sit with one person or even the exec team. It needs to be on every employee effectively in the workplace to make sure that they're looking after their own safety, also that their own acts or omissions aren't negatively impacting the safety of someone else. So we had this big thing back in the day where we'd do this big construction hall. There were like 400 tradies, and we had this thing, everyone who has OH&S obligations go on one side, everyone who doesn't go on the other side. And we got kind of like a 50-50 kind of split. And then we bring up the big slide as like a big twist. And of course, everyone should be on the side that they have OH&S responsibilities. So I think that's always a starting point. But I think it would be silly to not also recognize that the ability for, say, a junior receptionist to impact health and safety is way less than a senior leader that has the ability and oversight over different areas. And so the law respects that and places a higher duty of care and higher responsibility on the people that can actually enact wider systemic changes. So the CEO, directors, your senior leadership team, they've got the highest both responsibility and also risk exposure if they do this badly. So that's kind of always where I think in the starting point. You'll often see those individuals then look to get assistance. So they might have, say, an OH&S committee. They might bring in people in culture. They might have people with specific experience to try to be better equipped at dealing with that. They might have OH&S consultants they bring, for example, or lawyers. But generally, it's really meant to be seen as a collective because, for example, the CEO can't just delegate all their OH&S responsibilities to one person and feel free. And it also maybe is worth noting as well, and insurance is obviously a great thing, and I always recommend our clients have it. But in most states in Australia, there's actually an inability, it's unlawful for insurance policies to cover criminal penalties in relation to OH&S. So it might be able to cover your legal fees if something goes wrong, but it won't likely be able to cover penalties, so you personally. So I think it just further shows that we're really trying to place an onus on senior leaders in those different areas to kind of take this seriously. But yeah, Laura, I'm sure you've got kind of practical experience as well in terms of where it sits. But yeah, that's kind of our kind of thinking in terms of senior leaders from the top.
I completely agree with the senior leadership responsibility. And I think most initiatives to do with health and safety, but particularly in this space, in the absence of really visible commitment at that senior leader level, not much else is going to follow through on the back of that. But just to pick up on one of your points around having an enabling internal workforce that might include work health and safety as well as HR. This, I think, is an increasingly important area of collaboration that we're still seeing worked through in many ways. But if you think about the requirement to both prevent workplace sexual harassment or other forms of harmful workplace behaviours as well as respond appropriately, we really need that collective and combined thinking and approach from that sort of health and safety lens as well as that HR lens. And where this works harmoniously, it works really, really well. And I think we're much better equipped to develop far more effective and holistic strategies to controlling and preventing those sorts of risks of harm. But I think we're still navigating that space and understanding how we can work collectively and how we can work together to achieve those positive outcomes. But recognizing that need to collaborate in this space is a really important first step.
Yeah, absolutely. I think to your point earlier, Laura, about the benefits of this, when employers get it right and the discretion, the business benefits, people are happier, people are more effective in their work, they're performing better, there's that higher levels of discretionary effort. There's such a business case here for training the whole workforce in these in this area, isn't it? And your leaders across all levels, absolutely the senior levels need to be driving it forward and owning it, but really cascading that down through the leadership levels to influence every single person in the organization. So there's lots of opportunity for influence and ownership across all businesses, isn't there?
Absolutely. Leadership is central to that, especially in terms of thinking about if we need to enact practical controls or design work differently. Realistically, it's leaders who are going to be able to be best placed to inform how work needs to be done and different ways that we might approach that.
Absolutely. So, Andy, as a lawyer, are you seeing regulators take action in this space yet, or is it still everybody's watching and seeing what might happen?
We are actually seeing it, which is great to see, because my biggest pet peeve sometimes is that we bring out legislation, which in all kind of reports is a great thing to have. So the purpose is there. It's very clear in terms of what all employers should do. But then historically, we haven't necessarily been the best at funding regulators to actually go after and enforce these laws. It can feel a bit hard to try to persuade people to take it seriously if we're not seeing kind of case after case where these penalties have been kind of put through. So it's actually been nice to see in 2025, we're actually seeing more cases come through and more kind of publicised reports. So if I go through a few examples, just because I think they're kind of interesting in my world. If we take one, so Dovetail, I'm not sure if everyone's always aware of it. They're quite a successful startup. They're kind of embroiled at the moment, reportedly, in an issue between an in-house legal counsel. So the head of legal has actually lodged a claim against the business and the existing CEO that she felt sexually harassed and pressured into a sexual relationship, and failed the business's positive duty to prevent sexual harassment in the workforce. Now, I would just say what's interesting about this is no adverse findings have actually been found against Dovetail or the CEO. But if you Google Dovetail into Google, it doesn't come up in terms of all the positive or all the successes they've had from a business perspective. It only comes up with this sexual harassment complaint. So it's just interesting when people talk about, well, we haven't done anything wrong. The damage might have already been caused by simply getting the claim, given how much it's widely reported. Text messages have also come out through the claim process, which again further damages reputations. And also unique about this one, the in-house legal counsel, so the complainant is still the in-house legal counsel of the business and the CEO is still the CEO. So you've actually got, instead of normally where you might be able to separate and it's a former employee or former CEO, it's actually working out while they're still technically engaged by the business, which just creates an interesting employment law kind of situation, but also kind of devastating for a lot of the other employees that are probably dealing with it as well. And knowing their friends and families might be asking how they're going just because they know in the news that their business is kind of going through it. Fortunately also, and maybe I like this selfishly, it's very easy for lawyers sometimes to tell businesses what to do. But in this space, we're actually seeing the regulators heavily go after the legal industry, which again, is great. We're kind of terrible in terms of safety in the workforce normally, in terms of law firms. And if there's a need for regulators to look somewhere, law firms, it makes sense. So we've seen multiple prosecutions come through in law firms. So this year we've had a barrister that effectively has been penalised, and then also the law firm has been vicariously liable for the actions of the barrister against the law clerk. And you can read into that case if you Google it. There were just some obviously gross comments being made by a very senior barrister against someone very young. We also have a law firm that's been analysed $50,000. Again, penalty is not as big as it could be, but for a law firm, it's not nothing. And then also reputationally. And a really weird fact scenario on that one as well. There was a direction for an employee to watch a hockey movie at 1 a.m. in the morning on a Sunday and forced to share the bed with a female director. Just bizarre kind of situations that you kind of never expect. But that turned into a prosecution. And then earlier this month in Victoria, we actually had a $100,000 penalty applied against a toy company for some pretty bad comments made to a junior female employee. And effectively, the large penalty was not necessarily just because of the comments, but when the regulator looked into it, they took no steps to provide a safe workplace and didn't even have a policy in place. So again, just useful tools when we're trying to think about, are companies actually getting penalised in space? Are regulators looking into you? The answer is yes at the moment, which I think is really good. And I think just the way regulators often work in the past, they choose sectors or industries to go after at the same time. At the moment, it's law firms, which again is a good thing, but soon we'll be seeing them move into other industries and areas. So just because you may not be getting those entries reports at the moment from, say, WorkSafe Victoria or the Safe Working South Wales or wherever you're based, it doesn't mean that they're not going to coming up. And a lot of the regulators actually have a psychosocial hazards department at the moment, where about 10 years ago they didn't. So just again, further kind of evidencing that we are seeing kind of action in this space, which again is a good thing from a society point of view.
Absolutely. It's a great thing. There's action happening there. So employers should be paying attention. I think another thing worth saying is just because it hasn't happened in your workplace before doesn't mean it won't happen. And so it is important to be thinking about and taking those preventative actions anyway.
Yeah, exactly. And I might just add too, one of the things we keep saying with clients is that they say, well, that would never happen to us. But when you ask them questions in terms of, does inappropriate behavior happen? Is it correctly called out quickly? How many workers' compensation claims do you have? What is things that they might talk about as lead indicators? How much personal carers leave is being taken? When is it being taken? All of these factors might actually show your exposures a lot higher. So just because you haven't had that one big incident that you're aware of, it doesn't mean that inappropriate behavior isn't happening. And oftentimes what we see is if you allow little bits of inappropriate behavior, they can snowball into more inappropriate behavior. And then you've got 6 complaints coming through against the one senior leader. And so you might say, well, we never knew about this. But if you were being a bit more sophisticated about it, you probably would have been able to see a trend happen before it, which I think is a good thing. We're kind of, it's on us now to actually think more clearly about this rather than just being responsive.
The case is very clear for employers, isn't it? Time to take action if you're not already. So maybe let's start talking about prevention then. Laura, we'll talk about workplace design in a moment, but interested in your thoughts on how that incident response phase can be used as a tool to loop back and examine root cause and understand actually what has been happening in the workplace, what was happening. So what happens when an incident's investigated, and also if it's not found to be a non-compliance, what happens in that case too?
So this is a really interesting, and I would probably say somewhat emerging area, is that we have a long history of investigating individual incidents related to harmful workplace behaviours. And we would probably typically classify those as kind of an HR or legal type investigation to determine whether the allegations occurred and substantiate or not substantiate those allegations and put in appropriate consequences as a result. Increasingly, what we're seeing, I think, and I think a benefit that we're seeing in merging the health and safety lens into this space is applying a psychosocial safety incident investigation, depending on a number of different factors, but it might be a bit wider than just a single incident occurring within a workplace. There may be, to Randy's point, other data or triggers that point to the need for a safety investigation. The difference between a safety investigation and that sort of traditional HR investigation is that safety investigation doesn't necessarily look to substantiate or not substantiate particular allegations or claims. What it seeks to do is identify root cause factors contributing to the risk of that incident occurring in the first place and or future recurrences of that incident. And it's that root cause analysis that is particularly informative when it comes to what actions or controls or interventions do we currently have in place and or do we need to extend on in order to prevent this risk occurring again? And so I think the more that we merge that safety incident approach into investigations surrounding harmful workplace conduct, we can start to look at some of the broader cultural and systemic factors that may have been leading to this increased risk. Again, echoing Andy's thoughts that, you know, rather than wait for incidents to occur, ideally we are on the front foot with taking those preventative steps. But if and when they do occur, using that data and using that information to feed back into the overall system to strengthen that preventative approach. So I think we're thankfully seeing some great improvements there, of course, always underpinned by trauma-informed principles when we're talking about concurrent investigations, which is the whole other sort of control measure in and of itself. But we find it really better informs the preventative end. So whilst it's a response mechanism, it can help inform that obligation around prevention as well.
And so when we understand that more deeply, it enables us to take an intentional approach to the forward-facing design work that can be done. And I love the whole thought that employers can be intentional about how they design cultures and how they design environments and how they design workplaces in general. And not only to prevent harm, but to promote well-being as well. So I would love to hear your view and your experience, especially through your work at Australian Psychological Service, about this practical side of it, designing workplaces to be healthy, safe spaces for our people.
Absolutely. And I think this is where understanding root cause factors contributing to harmful workplace behaviours becomes really important. Because I think it would be easy to assume that just about the individual personalities or interpersonal scenarios that give rise to these occurrences in workplaces. In fact, when you take a look at the research in terms of those root cause contributing factors, some of the biggest contributors to the likelihood of harmful workplace behaviours includes things like role ambiguity, role conflict, role overload, work overload, high job demands, as well as work constraints. Now, if we're only solving for the interpersonal situation, we're missing that massive opportunity to actually design work more effectively to avoid the risk escalating from a harmful workplace behaviour perspective. And so in contrast, when you look at the research, again, in the work design space around what contributing factors or what workplace factors decrease the likelihood that people experience harmful workplace behaviours, here there's a couple of really standout factors, which is all around support, and that's including leadership support, which I'm sure we'll go into in much more detail, but as well as peer support and things like job control or job autonomy. So when we talk about work design, often it's thinking about designing the way in which we perform our work, which might be thinking about how we construct our work, how we look at the demands of our work, how we consider the social environment in which we're operating, and of course, as you mentioned, the physical environment in which we're operating as well. And the best way that I think about work design is when we understand the root cause contributing factors, both from a harm perspective as well as a protective perspective, what we're aiming to do is to manage or mitigate or eliminate the harm factors and maximize, prioritize, emphasize the protective factors. So I think this is where we're doing a lot of education with employers, and especially recognizing that good work design, good job design is one of our primary level controls. It's one of the most important things that we can do to prevent harm from occurring to our people, not just from a harmful workplace behaviours perspective, but for the ream of other psychosocial hazards that people are exposed to in their work. And I think it requires a very tailored response to understand what do those harm factors look like within your particular role, particular industry, environment, etc., as well as the makeup of teams. And likewise with the protective factors. So we're seeing a lot of success in helping or taking a team-based approach to how do we manage those harm factors, how do we enhance those protective factors, which inevitably requires leaders to understand that model of work design and the role that they play. And so that's twofold in terms of understanding the work design methodology, but also recognizing if we know support is such a key factor for the protective elements of work. How do we ensure that we've got the appropriate level of leadership capability in those leader roles? And if I think about a lot of the industries, especially that Andy, you've been speaking to, a lot of those industries prioritize the promotion of leaders on the basis of technical skill without necessarily thinking about the supportive leadership behaviours or the psychological competencies that might be required for the role. And whilst that applies to basically every role, the need for leaders to be particularly capable from a psychological job competency perspective is really important because it's so clear how much that relationship with our leader infiltrates our experience of work. Again, it directly influences our experience of the harmful behaviours or the harmful hazards, as well as influencing how we feel about those protective factors of work. So the leadership capability is another way in thinking about how do we design work effectively to ensure that it's protective. If we think too about addressing root cause factors when it comes to harmful workplace behaviours, we often spend a lot of time thinking about, did the behaviour occur or not? The other piece that I feel is missing from a lot of the work in this space is to understand the source of harm and the nature of that harm. Because again, in the absence of the knowledge of where that harm's likely to occur, it's really difficult to target that response. And so there are definitely some tools and some ways in which we're being, I think, more mature or sophisticated in the way that we assess those sources of harm and the nature of that harm, so that we can target initiatives more address sources of harm in a more targeted way, again, with the aim of eliminating those pieces. So it's really, I think, getting the whole industry more upstream, thinking about those preventative factors, being really clear on how do we design work effectively in the first place to create a positive and good experience of work, and thereby minimising those harm factors.
So much wisdom in there, and some really practical pathways for people to look into and start to take action on in their own workplaces. It's coming to mind for me that we're in a really different environment now than we were just 5 years ago, with a lot of people being more remote, et cetera, et cetera. So do all of these principles apply even in the virtual world of remote working? What do you both think about how this applies to this world?
Absolutely. It's even more crucial, I think, because I think in virtual environments, one of the things that COVID taught us is that people's social cues operate differently in those virtual environments. And so at least theoretically, probably practically too, we're at greater risk of experiencing those sources of harm. I'm also conscious there's a whole stream of work being done around workplace technology facilitated sexual harassment. I always think about it in the acronym, which is the WTF, sexual harassment. So it's a bit I always remember. And in that context, thinking about the way that we use digital tools, how we interact virtually, the risk of being attached to those tools in a much more prolonged way than we typically would have been attached to a workplace setting than what we have in the past, I think absolutely exemplifies the risk that we potentially have here if we don't manage those virtual environments more effectively.
Andy, any thoughts from you on this topic as well?
No, completely agree. I guess just importantly, the law doesn't distinguish between a physical office workplace or your own workplace. So we're just seeing more and more cases come through. And I really thought during COVID that my hope was that we would see less complaints come forward that say us and Law Squared would then have to investigate because we were remote. I was thinking, well, if we're not next to someone, surely instances of inappropriate behavior go down. But we actually found that they stayed the same, if not went up a little bit. And it just showed in different ways. I think that's what I always, unfortunately, the reality is that when people are nasty, they just use whatever avenue they've got in that situation. So we would have complainants and survivors of abuse tell us stories that they would effectively put a post-it note over the face of who they believed the perpetrator was on a Teams call just so they wouldn't have to see them. So really, really sad kind of stories like that where the impact to them was the exact same in terms of whether it was in person or virtual, and incidents were still happening. So yeah, I guess legally speaking, we just have to consider that home workplace the same as our in-office workplace in terms of our positive duty to prevent sexual harassment, but then also our general kind of OH&S obligations.
Yeah. Staying on this theme of prevention, it's very promising and positive to see that, Laura, you were the inaugural Chief Mental Health Officer for Commonwealth Bank Australia. Is this a role you think we're going to see more of? Do you have any examples of other organisations taking a similar approach? And do you recommend organisations take that kind of approach to really position someone to understand and own and influence an organisation in this space?
Look, short answer is yes to the above. So there's definitely other roles out there. In fact, there's a real burgeoning of demand for expertise around psychosocial risk being embedded within organisations. And I think there is definite benefit to that. I equally think this is where it becomes really important to understand the qualifications and experience and expertise that might sit behind that role. I still see it go wrong in the sense that where people don't really understand the psychosocial application under that sort of safety framework, which is really where the regulator focus is. We often miss the mark in terms of what that focus is on and whether we're taking or utilising that expertise effectively to really focus on that prevention end. So we're very much an advocate for ensuring that you've got the right expertise, driving that psychosocial risk expertise, and that might be internal or external. And I think sometimes, speaking from a consultancy point of view now, there is benefit, particularly for the senior leadership buy-in, to have that external influence to provide that advice and give that kind of industry-wide perspective on what good looks like in this space. One of the areas in particular that I think understanding good expertise when it comes to psychosocial risk management is this idea of applying prevention. And too often I unfortunately see recommendations that are around controls that focus on that individual level intervention, which means it's not addressing the system or the root cause factors that have contributed to people experiencing that increased risk of harm for workplace behaviours or harmful workplace behaviours or other forms of psychosocial hazards in workplaces. And so I think there's an opportunity to really kind of test that application of something like the hierarchy of controls, and not to get too safety speak on people, but ensuring that we're taking steps to eliminate and mitigate before we look at, are individuals resilient enough, or do they have mindfulness training? And even, evidence around things like sexual harassment training. There's limited evidence that actually changes behaviour. Where we really need to focus those efforts is how do we culturally shift the organisation around those preventative mechanisms, which relies not just on those individual expertise roles within organisations, but they have to work with that sort of vehicle, that workforce support that we talked about earlier in terms of uniting human resources, health and safety, injury management, other forms of that sort of workforce driving changes and improvements in this space.
So perhaps we can get a couple of examples from you in a little bit about organizations that have done that really well. Maybe you could give us some really specific examples. But knowing that a big portion of our listeners today might be coming from an in-house legal space, do either of you have thoughts on the intersection of legal obligations with workplace design, psychological safety? Where are the challenges of those things collaborating? We're talking about how valuable those collaborations could be. What are the challenges that are getting in the way of that happening? And maybe how can people remove those challenges so we can see more of that happening in their workplaces?
Maybe if I can start from my both internal and external experience, I think bringing those different roles and responsibilities together, understanding who owns what pieces, but also how they build a bigger picture together. And I think the workplace sexual harassment space is actually such a great space to do this in, because there are united objectives around prevention and response. There are similar expectations around eliminating exposure to those sorts of forms of harm within the workplace. And in order to do that, when you look at that sort of elimination mitigation strategy, it talks to the things like culture, it talks to things like learning, it talks to things like creating safe physical and social environments. And in order for those sorts of prevention controls to be put in place, you really need all of those parties to work together to articulate what that plan is. When you start to introduce things like trauma-informed principles, you need all of those parties to understand what that means for their particular piece of work, and again, how that feeds into a bigger picture of taking a trauma-informed and person-centered approach. So in my experience, I think there's been real benefit in bringing those parties together, working very collaboratively, where I've had internal working groups on these sorts of matters with representatives from each of those parties. That's worked so well to ensure that we're driving towards a united strategy and that we have relative ownership in each of those parts. And when we need to activate things like investigations, we each understand the purpose of those investigations, when they might happen, and the process that might be undertaken. I think it's really difficult to do some of those things in the absence of good collaboration between those parties.
Any thoughts from you, Andy, on that?
The only thing I'll add is that businesses do need to give resources in this space. I think oftentimes where we see the issue is that everyone knows that collaboration is a good thing, and that to have a really good OHS framework, you need all those different parties involved. But oftentimes those senior people are pretty under the pump in terms of their existing workloads and what they're currently prioritizing. And so And oftentimes, and this is just the reality, those individuals may actually feel like they are at most risk to their own safety in terms of all of these different psychosocial hazards we're picking out. So unless they're actually supported to have the bandwidth and the time to actually do this properly, that's oftentimes where we see a fall down in collaboration, because they just don't have the bandwidth to be able to give time to it. And all you're doing is potentially making them work their 45th to 50th hour for the week to try to push this through, which then can just lead to it being a really bad kind of process. So yeah, my only thing is I definitely empathize with in-house legal counsels, head of HR, OH&S, individuals, just because from a timing perspective, there is a challenge. So I would just encourage businesses to kind of actually put resources into this so that those individuals have the capacity to actually do it properly.
It's a great point, and it's a real challenge, isn't it? So it isn't always a case of employers saying it's not a priority, we don't see it as important. It is, there's several competing priorities for senior leaders always in every context. So how do we push this to the top, allocate the resourcing that we have to it, or dedicate more resourcing if we can to these important topics? This whole conversation is making it very evident how important this work is to be done, and that the top performing organizations aren't just doing tick the box exercises to comply and, do the minimum. They're really going beyond compliance and building an environment that promotes amazing performers, creates great teamwork. Laura, you made a comment earlier about how some of the design work is best done at a team level, and that makes a lot of sense. This statistic might be aging now. I will have to fact check myself on this as it relates to today, but it has been said for a long time that up to 80% of the employment experience is directly influenced by a person's direct line manager and direct team that they're working in, which makes sense, doesn't it? So whether it's that exact statistic or not, the sentiment is the same. And so, of course, the advice when we're talking about organizational culture is that team-based culture conversations are the most effective. And in this case, it would be the same, that teams are talking about what are our own ways of working. So in the context of the organization and its policies, what are our ways of working? What are our ways of interacting? What does good look like for us? What does safe look like for us? What's important for us when we need to have robust conversations? How are we going to do that in a safe way and continue on, et cetera, et cetera? So Laura, I wanted to throw it back to you and see, do you have a couple of specific examples of organizations who have done a really good job at this? And maybe what were their first steps? So for organizations thinking through what's like the first couple of steps that I could take to start doing this work, whether it is looking at job design or any of the things that we've talked about so far, where would you recommend people start, and what's an example of an organization that's taken some really positive first steps?
It's a really good question, and I would be reluctant to give kind of a one-size-fits-all answer, but maybe let me start with absolutely underlining the statements in terms of that relationship that people have with their leaders and their team environment influencing their experience of work. And so one of, I think, the investment pieces that's really important for workplaces to focus on is equipping and embedding that really good supportive leadership capability. They drive so much of the protective as well as harm minimization design piece in this space, particularly when it comes to harmful workplace behaviors. So having that really capable leadership set. And as part of that, we often talk about this concept of cognitive empathy, which is essentially to what degree do leaders understand their people's experience of work? Do they spend time with their team understanding what are their barriers, what are their challenge opportunities, what's the bit that they love and that they turn up to work for every day, what gets in the way of achieving those things, and therefore what do we need to do differently to address those things? That concept of kind of practical work design is really just influenced by asking some good questions from that cognitive empathy kind of view to understand people's experience of work and take steps to maximize that. So we really, I think that's one investment piece that I see done really well, is where organizations have embedded this capability with their leaders to directly influence that experience of work and develop that strong understanding of work. I think to take a step back from harmful workplace behaviour specifically, but maybe thinking more holistically around psychosocial safety and risk management, often a really good starting point is to do a bit of analysis of and take stock. Where are we at? What have we got? What does it point to? And within that, absolutely considering things like positive duty. And I'm all for integrating the positive duty and harmful workplace behaviour management into that broader psychosocial risk sort of view as well. To look at what are the gaps that we have, what are the bits that we already have in place that we can leverage, and how do we bring that up to speed to meet the needs and ensure that we are embedding a very proactive and continuous improvement approach to psychosocial safety. That kind of infrastructure review or gap analysis as a starting point can be really useful, particularly for those who might be more in the infancy of their journey, to understand what are the key pieces for us that we need to look at. And ensure that we've got that really robust system around psychosocial safety. And I would always argue, as I said, that if we integrate the harmful workplace behaviour piece in there, that we're tackling that positive duty element as well. Maybe to give a couple of examples of workplaces that we've supported that I think may be biased, but they are doing a really good job. We typically started with that infrastructure review, given some advice in terms of what are the key gaps that we might see there. And in some examples of greater maturity, often the health and safety system holistically is really solid. It's just adding those psychological elements to it to give it that particular time in the sun and make sure people understand what that looks like, how we're measuring it, assessing it, et cetera, et cetera. Followed by that good leadership capability development, alongside often with some particular targeted risk mitigation work. Now, that might be in the harmful workplace behaviour space, so creating things like, I don't know, this was mentioned earlier, sexual harassment prevention plans, training those trauma-informed principles, embedding psychosocial safety investigations within the workplace. But that might cross over into things like managing exposure to potentially traumatic materials or events. And if we think about some of those in-house teams, in-house legal, in-house HR, who may be responsible for those HR investigations, thinking about the risk that they may be exposed to in terms of those roles as well. So it can be quite a big beast. I think it's chunking it down depending on what the particular needs are, where they're at the maturity cycle, and what the particular hazards or sources of harm might be.
Excellent. Yeah, so taking a step back, a current state assessment, and also you emphasize that leadership capability investment. Yes, and I love that saying, when the leader gets better, the whole team gets better. And it's true, isn't it? When you invest in your leader, they have better conversations, they lead better, they create better environments, they create better culture, so the whole team lifts. So it's a very worthy investment on all topics, and especially this one. And so, Andy, what about from a legal perspective? What are the practical tips you would offer at both the preventative and response phase for ensuring psychological safety?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And my legal answer is always a bit more boring, just because all of the substantial work that Laura was talking about, like that's all the meaty parts in terms of actual change. The legal parts I always talk about is we often do all of that great work, but sometimes we don't actually put it in writing that we've done it. So oftentimes if a regulator comes on site and they say, we've had these instances, the first things they ask for are your policies, procedures. It might be your prevention plans. It might be attendance records or trainings that you've done. So that's where they fall down, because they say that verbally we've done all these things, but they actually can't point to something in writing that showcases that. So from the legal answer is to do all the amazing work in psychosocial hazards for identification, analyzation, controls and review, but then also to have a really good policy framework behind that backs that up. It also really helps go against the argument that people don't know where to go with concerns or to raise complaints, because you've got these documents in place that really evidently and clearly kind of set out where they go with those concerns, and also making sure that there's always more than one place that they can go. We've just seen in the past that can really prevent issues if they can only go to, say, their CEO, and the CEO is the one that has the issue. And then obviously just backing that up to make sure that those are kind of livable, breathable documents. So actually reviewing them and editing them, reflecting any, say, consultations that you've done and the information you've got through those, and then running training when you can in terms of your senior leaders, your board as well. And then also maybe a slightly lesser training session for your more general kind of staff population, just to make sure that it's kind of, we're talking about it quite regularly rather than something we just address every 3 months. So yeah, those are, I guess, are the legal bits, more so to just cap off the great work that you might have done already in the psychosocial hazard space.
Absolutely. So it's about bringing it to life, right? We can't just have stuff. We just have stuff in the business. We've got to train it. We've got to communicate it. There needs to be feedback loops, regular feedback loops, lots of touch points to keep it alive in the organization. It's really, really important. So we're approaching the end of our time together. That's gone so fast, and you have both have shared so much gold in this conversation. So could I ask you both to share any final thoughts for our listeners on how they and their organizations can create clear, sustainable plans for respect at work, and ensuring that that can tie into their long-term strategies, but also their short-term compliance focus as well? Maybe Laura, you want to kick us off, and then we'll throw to Andy.
Okay, how to nut this down in a couple of key takeaways. I think firstly, in recognizing the sort of aspirational benefits of investing in this space, and that when we get it right, we create an environment that really supports people from that health and wellbeing perspective, but also adds to those real business benefits that, you know, lead to greater sustainability, economic productivity, et cetera, et cetera. So I think firstly, coming from that place is a really helpful way to think about this whole area. And then I would say taking the steps to invest in the right spaces to uplift your organization, particularly as it relates to, I think, respect at work. It's thinking about, similar to what Andy said, you know, there's policies and procedures in place, making sure that they're really underpinned by those important sort of trauma-informed principles and protecting our people, through to training and equipping our organization with a big focus on leaders, because they play such an important role in bringing this to life, to use your words. And that starts from the top, but it's got to cascade through to all layers of leadership to ensure that we're role modeling, really undertaking these behaviours that we know are going to create that healthy and safe work environment for people.
Incredible. And Andy, your final thoughts?
I always just fall back to, especially in industries that are kind of renowned for being quite terrible in this space in history, really the aim in my head is just to make sure that our workplaces are better than our parents' workplaces and their parents' workplaces, so that people don't feel dreaded on a Sunday night going into their workforce. It means they're more likely to want to stay in that business. There is a study back in 2024 that over 70% of employees said that they would look at leaving a business that they felt didn't take sexual harassment seriously in the workforce. So, and unfortunately, I get to see this all the time, and other people don't, but gone are kind of the days where someone would lodge a complaint of sexual harassment and we would walk the complainant out subject to a deed. The best businesses we've seen at the moment, and a lot of our clients, are the ones that do actually have a zero tolerance to inappropriate behaviour. So as soon as they get an allegation of sexual harassment, they immediately stand them down, they run an investigation, and in most situations, they actually terminate them because of that. And then they provide all the support in the world to the person that came forward. And it's such a wonderful thing that we can do as employers, is to actually showcase that we actually walk the way that we talk. So we're actually implementing these steps. And those are the businesses that people want to stay at for 10, 20 years. So regardless of the ethical, moral kind of standpoint, it's just actually good business, so to speak, to be gross about it, but to actually look after our staff in this way and to take that kind of approach. So yeah, I guess from a non-legal point of view, that's kind of what I'm thinking about.
Absolutely. Thank you both so much for generously sharing your expertise and experiences with all of us. I'm very certain that if anyone jumped on the call today needing a little bit of advice about what next step, what first step or what next step to take, they have got a wonderful spread of information, the history, the stats, the why it's important, the how we can approach it, who should be involved in your workplace, how to really influence using all levels of the organization. So thank you both so much for being here and sharing that. And thank you to everybody that's watching as well. We have seen a number of questions come through. We've answered some of them, and the rest we will review and be sharing some resources to help answer those for you as well. A final comment is that if this is a topic that you would like to dig further into, Andy is actually hosting a Respect at Work officer training workshop in Melbourne on the 7th of August. It's a half-day workshop co-hosted with a psychologist and partner in people risk from the Howden Group. So Andy, do you want to give us a quick rundown of what will be involved in that if anybody's interested in coming along on the 7th?
Yeah, of course. Very quickly, it's a session kind of designed for businesses to nominate particular senior leaders to come and kind of be their designated Respect at Work officer. So it will go through a lot of the positive duty information and how they can take that back to their workplace. But oftentimes, and most importantly, it'll kind of try to upskill and try to fix that gap, Laura, you were talking about in terms of technical people become managers but don't often get training to do that. So part of that session will also just be how to actually sensitively and with a trauma-informed approach receive complaints and to make people feel comfortable, because that's oftentimes where we see the gap fall down. So we'll be giving out kind of resources in terms of policies and prevention plans as part of that. But yeah, definitely we'll send the link through the chat so you can sign up if you want to. But it might be good if you're in people and culture, your OH&S committee, or just a senior leader, just something to think about.
Thanks, Andy. So if you're Melbourne-based, the registration link will be added into the sidebar in a moment. And if you're in another state, and you're interested and would like a workshop like that, maybe drop Andy a line and let him and his team know, and maybe they can make that happen as well. And of course, if you need any other support managing the employment life cycle or understanding any other workplace obligations, Andy and his team, reach out to them and I'm sure they can help you. The Law Squared team there is great. So that is it from us. Thank you again for joining, and we look forward to connecting with you at another time in the future. So thank you and goodbye.